Good evening, everyone. I'm Kat Lloyd from the Tenement Museum's Education Department. Thank you so much for being here with us this evening. Tonight, we'll be discussing A is for Asylum Seeker, a book that explores words for people on the move over the course of US history. And if you're not familiar with the Tenement Museum, we're a museum located on Manhattan's Lower East Side. And we explore stories of immigrants, migrants, and refugees through personal stories, both past and present. And we host a range of virtual programs every week, including these Tuesday evening book talks. So I'm honored to be joined here tonight by Rachel Ida Buff, the primary author of tonight's book, as well as Iuscely Flores, the illustrator of the book, and Alejandra Oliva, the author of the book's Spanish translation. And we're excited to hear from you all tonight as well. So please ask questions, join the conversation using the chat feature on YouTube. And A for Asylum Seeker is available for purchase from the Tenement Museum's online store at shop.tenement.org. So let's start with some introductions before getting into the conversation about the book itself. So Rachel, could you start us off?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for making it on this very strange evening in this very strange time. I'm Rachel Ida Buff. I wrote the English text of A is for Asylum Seeker, which we'll be talking about tonight. And I'm a writer and a historian. I teach at the University of Wisconsin here in Milwaukee, where I live.
Wonderful. Thanks, Rachel. And Iuscely.
Hi, everyone. Iuscely Flores. She, her, they pronouns. I am in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I had the privilege to illustrate the book cover for Rachel's book, as well as 5 or 6 pages within the book. I currently am the Civic Engagement Associate at State Voices.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Alejandra.
Hi, I'm Alejandra, and I did the Spanish translations of Rachel's fantastic book, which is kind of unique in this copy because it's presented alongside the English words. And in my day job, I am the communications coordinator at the National Migrant Justice Center in Chicago, which is where I'm based.
Thank you so much. And I think you've already raised some of the ways that you came to this project. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation tonight, particularly because the ideas that you bring to the book connect so much to the work that we do at the Tenement Museum, but also feel so important in this particular moment. As you said, Rachel, we're gathered here tonight on this strange time on Inauguration Eve. And I really look forward to hearing from you all on how you see this work relevant today and in the future. So the book, A is for Asylum Seeker, it's an alphabetical look at 26 words of migration and movement. And it's really incredibly unique. And really, every entry includes a personal story, a description of the political and social context of the word, as well as a Spanish translation. So it's a format that I had never seen before in a book on migration. And Iuscely, your drawings really offer these meaningful images to punctuate the stories throughout. So to give everyone here tonight a sense of this book and its structure and the stories that are contained within it, Rachel, I'll turn it over to you now to read us an excerpt from the book before we dive into some conversation.
Thanks, Kat, and thanks to the Tenement Museum. I appreciate so much being hosted. I'm a huge fan of the Tenement Museum. My kids grew up in the past by going to the Tenement Museum. I love its model of engaged public history that talks about the past and insists on the present. And I'm so inspired and happy to be here. And thanks to Kat and Arabella and Selena for all their work. I wanted to say just a couple things, and then I'm going to read a little piece from the book. That our format tonight with Alejandra and Iuscely and me, we've kind of worked up this roadshow and done some events together, but it also really reflects to me the collaborative spirit of this book, which really comes out of my and our distinct and different engagement with immigrant rights formations. That's how we know each other. That's how we enter into the work. And that's so important. And then, doing these events together has also generated new kinds of relationships between us and new kinds of conversations. So I'm really happy to be involved in this particular immigrant rights formation that we've created here. I guess just to preface this book came out of what seemed at the time in the spring of 2019 to be a terrible crisis, which never really ended and didn't start then, of draconian inhumanity towards people on the move, at the border, within the border, beyond the borders. And, you know, if anything, our would-be despots' last week trip to Alamo, Texas, as distinct from the Alamo, I had to look it up, but they're different, right? To see his pride and joy, the border wall, at a moment of sort of executive desperation, that he turns to that side of violence and theft and dispossession, I think should let us know that this is a very old crisis. And one of the central contentions throughout A is for Asylum Seeker is that Indigenous displacement and dispossession, which is as old as Euro-American presence in this hemisphere, is the source of causes of migration from 1492 to 2021, right? And violence against what we could call these popular insurgencies, which is people leaving to survive, is the source of immigration restriction. That's as true in the time of the what was then called the Great Wave of Migration, in the sort of heyday that the Tenement Museum documents. It's true now, you know. So that's a very fundamental precept of this work. And then, you know, the place we are now in this country, which seems remarkable. I take Spanish lessons every week with a woman in Guatemala. And a couple of weeks ago, she taught me a phrase in Spanish, which means it's your turn, because we were talking about democracy and the lack of therein in our respective countries. And then I taught her Malcolm X's phrase, the chicken's coming home to roost. And we kind of laughed bitterly about what these things mean and how they circulate. But I think it's important that as horrifying as this moment is in the United States, that we have practiced the coup, fomenting the coup, all over the world, particularly in Latin America and Central America, and that many of the people being demeaned at the border by not being allowed in as asylum seekers by the Remain in Mexico policy, stuff that we'll talk about tonight, leave their countries because of exactly these policies fomented by the United States. So those are just some preamble things I wanted to say. And then Kat had requested particularly that I read M is for Migrant. I want to say that this book is alphabetical, but you know, there's a lot of entries for C and none for W. And there's actually not 26, Kat, there's like 32 because I couldn't keep it to 26. So that would have been the right thing to have done. So you were right about that, but that's not what we did. So anyway, this is M is for Migrant. And as Kat said, every entry starts with a story and then goes on to some sort of academic, scholarly, slightly scholarly exposition. It's really written to be read by actual people, including high school students. And then it's facing page translation, or I learned this word in the course of writing this book, what's called, recto verso, verso recto. Anyway, so Migrant. Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 1956. Velvelia Hortense Rogers Phillips, or Vel, as she is widely known, becomes the first African-American and the first woman elected to the city's Common Council. Her historic election reflects the increasing African-American population in the city. During the Great Migration, 6 million African-Americans left the segregation and racial terror of the rural South. They settle in urban centers in the Northeast, Midwest, and West Coast. Drawn by the prospect of employment in Milwaukee's flourishing industries, what's called a late Great Migration by my colleague Rob Smith brings increasing numbers of African Americans to the city after 1945. Phillips is born in Milwaukee in 1924, the daughter of Black migrants from the South. Although they sought freedom in the North, Black migrants encountered structural racism in their new homes. Northern cities lack the Jim Crow segregation policies prevailing in the South, but housing, employment, and schools remain segregated and unequal. In Milwaukee, a system of restrictive covenants and white supremacist real estate and banking practices confine African Americans to residence in the inner core, an industrial urban neighborhood that had been home to generations of European migrants to the city. Because Milwaukee children attend schools by neighborhood, Area schools such as North Division High School become majority African American as the city's Black population grows to 60,000 by 1960. Recognizing the role played by residential segregation in maintaining racial inequality, Phillips introduces the first open housing ordinance to the City Council in 1962, and again in 1963 and 1967. Each time it is defeated by the white majority. In 1967, Phillips and the NAACP Youth Council stage a rally for open housing, initiating a long campaign of open housing marches, which include conflicts with organized white residents sporting swastikas, as well as civil disobediences and the mass arrests of protesters. The open housing marches continue through 1967 and 1968. After the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1968, the United States Congress passes fair housing legislation. Subsequently, the Milwaukee Common Council votes to pass one of Phillips' open housing ordinances, stronger than the federal policy. African American organizers like Vel Phillips prevailed in reshaping housing policy in Milwaukee during the 1960s, but structural inequality persists. As whites moved out of the city, state funding inequities continue to plague the majority non-white Milwaukee public school system, essentially taking tax monies from city residents and awarding them to majority white suburban and rural schools. Milwaukee consistently ranks as one of the most segregated cities in the country. A legacy of segregation, the 95% Black 53206 area code has the highest incarceration rate in the nation. Tellingly, the Vel R. Phillips Juvenile Justice School is one of the places honoring the name of the civil rights hero. Of all the words in this book, migrant is closest to a general term for people on the move. The word migration broadly describes the comings and goings of creatures, humans, and wildlife. Similarly, the word peregrination, meaning a pilgrimage or a journey, shares origin with the word peregrine, a bird of prey that flies over fields and forests. Policies attempting to curtail human border crossing often affect the migration patterns of other creatures. The construction plan for the illegal wall at the US-Mexico border carves up parks and refuges, disrupting wildlife migration patterns and destroying rare border ecosystems. In the winter of 2019, indigenous activists and allies from the Carrizo Comecrudo Nation set up an encampment near the National Butterfly Center in Texas to protest the harm to wildlife as well as human burial grounds if the wall is constructed there. Applied to humans, the word migrant can describe people who move within national boundaries, like African Americans during the Great Migration. Migrants often move within their home nations to a different city or region before leaving the country. Sometimes the word is also used to describe people crossing national borders. Caravans of people on the move arriving at the US-Mexico border are often described in contemporary media and public policy as migrants. The 20th century advent of legal terms like refugee and asylum seeker elevated these categories of people on the move as particularly deserving of safe harbor, inadvertently degrading the status of migrants as people who cannot achieve refugee status and are therefore considered less deserving. Pueblos Sin Fronteras, a refugee-led organization supporting some of these caravans, deliberately uses the words refugee, migrant, immigrant, and citizen interchangeably, dramatizing the arbitrary nature of these politically loaded terms. In the case of the Great Migration, the word migrant is often used to describe African Americans who fled repression in one part of the United States and moved to other regions in search of a better life. These migrants can also be described as refugees from racial terror. Vel Phillips' story illuminates the ongoing struggle faced by migrants in their new homes. In cities like Oakland, California, Black migrant women drawn to the area for industrial work during World War II later formed a core of support for the emergence of radical Black groups like the Panthers in the late 1960s.
Thank you, Rachel. And hearing you read this again brought back so many of the reasons why I had thought that particular entry was a helpful starting point for our audience tonight, some of whom may have read this book or might be familiar with the ideas and terms within it. But as the Tenement Museum has been really thinking about how language shapes our understanding of migration and human experiences, just looking at how you detail the political context of this word for African Americans coming to Milwaukee in the middle of the 20th century, and then expand out for us how that term is in some ways both an umbrella term and a term that, has, as you said, been used to apply to, differently than a term like refugee or asylum seeker. So a helpful starting point for seeing how you're able to share these personal stories in then this political and social context. And I want to come back to some of the ideas expressed within that particular chapter. But Rachel, in your opening sentiments, you also really, I think, speak to what I was so inspired by within the book of how you position this work within immigrant rights activism. And I'd love to actually open up to Iuscely and Alejandra and Rachel as well. Just how did you get involved in this project and how did you come to this work? So actually, Alejandra, I'd love for you to start with this one, and then we'll come to Iuscely and then Rachel.
Sure. So I actually met Rachel in 2019 in January. We were both in Tijuana, kind of there to respond to the migrant caravan that had really made the news around the midterms. And so both of us were there doing accompaniment, sort of helping people with all the tiny logistical whatevers that are happening when you're about to cross a border. Like, where do I put my suitcases? Who has my phone numbers? I'm getting ready to cross. What's even going to happen to me? And so that work was incredibly difficult and moving. And then we would kind of all hang out together afterwards, or in the evening, sort of after the work was over for the day, and hang out and chat. And then a couple months later, after we'd all, gone home, Rachel popped up in my inbox and was like, do you know anyone who might be interested in doing this translation work? And I'd been translating on and off little things here and there. And one of the things that I find really important personally is this idea of language justice and making sure that there is a parity and that people are able to access information and resources and even conversations without assuming that English is always the default language. And so this really spoke to a lot of my interests, both as far as my day job in immigration, and then also doing making sure that Rachel's really important contribution was available to many people who might need it. And these are just two languages. They represent two languages that are spoken by a lot of people who end up coming into the US, but it's obviously not an exhaustive project. And, fantasies of further translations are exciting to me.
Of course, and I appreciate that you addressed that within the introduction as well of the book, that the Spanish translation is one of many languages that you hope for this work to be accessible in. And I think it is certainly an important aspect of the structure of the book that the side to which you open the book on is the Spanish translation. So you see the Spanish first when you open the book, which I really appreciated. It was something I hadn't seen in a translated book before. So Iuscely, how did you get involved in this project?
So I first met Rachel at a Jewish Voices for Peace and Students for Justice in Palestine, and a couple of other organizations that had collaborated together. And this was in 2017. And I had the opportunity, I think, to speak and show solidarity as a Latina immigrant. And I remember just sharing while I was speaking. I was invited to speak to it maybe an hour before the event, so I hadn't written anything. But I remember just saying, any border anywhere in the nation and in the world is a border that shouldn't exist. somewhere along those lines. And so we remained connected through that as I was a student at the university. And then I got to meet Rachel again when they invited us to speak in front of, I think, the different it was like the president. It was a board. We were trying to make UWM a camp, like a sanctuary campus. So she kind of gave us the space to take over that meeting as students and be heard. So I would always commend her for letting us use our voice in any space that she creates and generates. And in 2019, I had met over coffee. We had met over coffee. I was giving her a graphic design that I'd made of her family. And I just kind of had shared like how my parents had self-deported a year ago in 2019, and how I hadn't received my DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. I didn't have a job. It was like this whole thing of like I think I had the privilege of going through a midlife crisis at only like 20 years old. Because then I don't have to worry, I don't have to worry about it in my later years. But Rachel was like so supplemental to my growth those last almost 5 years. It was I think the greatest opportunity that grounded me in my existence in this country. We go through the term ni de aquí ni de allá, so not from here, not from there. And I think it solidified like my reason to continue in this country and continue working and believing in the work of what Milwaukee is and does for community and organizers like myself.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And Rachel, I think it really comes through within the book, your allyship and your solidarity towards immigrants, and particularly immigrants of color who experience sort of harsher, lives within this country. And, it's very clear that your work is informed by that kind of outlook. And so I would love to hear from you, Rachel, how you kind of imagine this project. I know you told us a little bit at the beginning, and I would, sure our audience would be curious to hear more how you got involved in imagining this book into being.
So I guess this book is like an integration for me. I've always in my career done immigrant rights work and scholarly work, and I've done them both, and this represents the two of them, kind of me imagining that my life as a writer and thinker could have something to do with my life as an activist, which hasn't always been organic to me. So for me, it's like, it's a really happy space, even though it comes out of a terrible time. And, a lot of it comes out of, I think Iuscely and I know each other from sort of the Milwaukee immigrant rights scene, which I've been involved in since I moved here in 2004. But then sort of getting involved with stuff at the border when Alejandra and I met, it was through the New York's New Sanctuary Coalition, they were having a presence there in December of 2019. And I guess I'll say that lots in my life, I've gone the wrong way. So maybe I have some sympathies with people who stray. So I was just thinking before this started that in 2018, very early 2019, I was in New York for a conference, an academic conference up at Barnard. And I've been trying to get in touch with folks from the New Sanctuary Coalition because I wanted to give them a copy of my last book, Against the Deportation Terror, which is about this amazing band of leftist activists at mid-century. It's a much more academic book, but I wanted to give it to them because I had written it for people in the immigrant rights movement to know that they have a history, that we have a history. And I finally got through to somebody who said, yeah, can you come out and meet me in Queens? And it was the night of the plenary session at the conference. And I was like, oh, I'm totally going to Queens. So I guess I have to say that like this book for me is an affirmation that straying is productive and that political work complements scholarly work in ways that might not be planned, but that have been really crucial in my life.
Thank you. And you can really see that within the book, right? The way that all of you, from your different perspectives, connect history to current politics, to immigrants' rights activism, and that you are blending what you've seen in each of these different, sometimes separate spheres into this one very, very unique project. So another process question, because this book really, spans sort of traditional genres or even categorization, I'd be curious to hear a bit about what your process was for working on your particular part of A is for Asylum Seeker. So how did you approach the work, and what was your process for developing, whether it was the translation, the illustrations, or the initial text? So perhaps, Iuscely, we start with you for this question.
So the title, the cover itself was we brainstormed a lot of things. We thought about, and I wanted to make sure like Rachel's vision came to life, but it was going to be like the block letters that little kids are used to playing with. The A was going to be like a block letter and kind of like around that tone. But then every single person that is pictured on the cover is an actual migrant with a story. And I took that same approach when illustrating parts of her book. And they're all people from different borders around the world. And I think that adds some sort of like depth, right? That only I would know as an artist, because once you have it and you see the book, you see, a book cover. So just getting to share that part of the process it's kind of been really nice and cool. You'll also see, I think I can share my screen. You'll see this part of the book, which is inside her book. And I think the importance of this, I mean, it speaks for itself, right? Like what you see, but the small kind of like gas bombs that are at the bottom, like they are also all from different parts of the world. I mean, they're made in the USA, and you see them in Palestine, you see them, everywhere. You see them in Syria. Like these things are global. And then this dreamer sign in particular has been seen all over protests in the United States. It's a photographer couple and his girlfriend, and the guy usually takes pictures of just like the dreamer sign and then what's in front of her. And again, this is a Black man from Ferguson, and the back and the riot police is all from different uprisings in all over the world, but in particular Ferguson. So as an artist, and especially in graphic design, like you get to play with so many different meanings and depths of word and different works, and you can make them all into one. So it was exciting to kind of make that come to life in her book and in different illustrations.
Thank you. And I just learned a lot about how your work was inspired by these elements of society. Thank you. And Alejandra.
Yeah, so I got to deal with a little bit of like the bureaucratic side of publishing. So I had about, I want to say 2 to 3 months to like copy, edit, and translate the whole thing, which was a little bit of a tight deadline. So a lot of it was just like me sitting at home, like going through stuff. But I think one of the translation choices that I made that I want to talk about is the effort to use gender neutral language throughout the book as much as possible. Spanish is a really gendered language. Nouns have genders that are like grammatical, but then also they're more problematically, I think there is this assumption that like in a group of 10 people, if 9 of them are women and 1 of them is a man, then the whole group gets a male adjective. And so there's been some exciting like workarounds by young queer activists who are, playing with language and modifying it, across the Spanish speaking world. And so throughout the book, you'll see an E ending, which is something that is used that it's a little more, it's meant to be gender neutral. It's meant to encompass everyone kind of under its umbrella. And so you'll see that when I'm referring to, especially the titles of the sections, if the story that Rachel is telling is about a man or a woman, then that is the gender that word is given. But if it is about a group of people or about a situation that encompasses, you know, a variety of people, then I'll have stuck on the E ending, because it's important to note that this is everyone. It's men, it's women, it's non-binary people, it's trans people who are crossing the border and getting, in some cases, like very different kinds of treatment due to their identities. And so that's one of the I think bigger choices that I made in translating this book, like amid the like fevered typing, that I feel really pleased with how that turned out.
And you know, your note about that at the beginning as well, I think is the way I saw it, part of the education of the book, of really explaining to the readers, these are some of the limitations of the sort of traditional Spanish language, and here's how we're going to kind of work against that. So I think it also, Alejandra, the example you just shared, really helps you know, our audience see how this book really does have this sort of feminist foundation and anti-racist foundation within the approach to the book itself. So Rachel, I will turn it over to you now to talk a little bit about your process for working on the book. And sorry if you can hear my dog barking in the back.
I'm just so happy it's your dog and not my dog. So and it has to be a dog. So
it has to be a dog in every virtual event.
It does. So I read a lot of history books, though my preference, to be totally honest, is to read novels. But a lot of my historian colleagues, they'll start out the history book with some incredibly gripping story, and they'll write in the first person, and you like fall in, and then on page 5, you just land in the cold, harsh fluorescence of historical prose, and you're like, huh. You know, and I've had the experience, having written historical books, of like giving them to people I love who, you know, who aren't historians, and coming back to visit them years later and seeing the dog ear on page 5, you know, and I wanted to write a book that people would want to read, you know, and that people would be able to read. The book I wrote before this, Against the Deportation Terror, I've said this before, but it was an important revelation that came out of one of these conversations. That was a love letter to the immigrant rights movement, but no one read it. It's a bummer to write a love letter that no one reads. Like my colleagues, my historian colleagues read it, and my other historians of the mid 20th century left read it, but immigrant rights folks didn't have time to read it because it's academic-y. It had to get me a certain place in my field, all that stuff. I wanted a book that people could use. Like we actually had conversation when this was being in production, like what's the right size of somebody could stick in their back pocket? You know, I wanted it to be useful, and I wanted it to be engaging, and I wanted it to be not horrible for high school students. Last year, I went to a 4th grade class in Ixonia, which is a rural community not far from where I live, to talk about immigration. And then the teacher just invited me back, and I was like, hey, you know, you could look at this book. Like your kid's like maybe a little hard reading, but it was really written for anyone to read, to be able to read. So that was really an important evolution for me as a writer and as a historian. Like I think there are so many of us who see ourselves as radical historians, but we wind up writing in very small circles, and I wasn't interested in doing that anymore.
And I mean, certainly I devoured the book within a couple of days, and it's so accessible and brings what can be very, very big ideas into very clear personal stories. And you really see how language and words impact people and have then the power to kind of help us imagine a different society. And that really, you know, all of your work within this book, sort of putting forward how language is political and how language has the potential to be used to humanize or dehumanize. I would be curious to hear your reflections on how you've seen language shaping sort of misunderstanding about migration, and how maybe getting into a little bit of the content, the meat of the book. You know, how do you see that particular terms being used for misunderstanding?
Well, this actually comes out of a part of the book I didn't read, but it's from Know Your Rights, which is about a campaign that we had here in Milwaukee in the fall of 2019 and won to get ICE to stop collaborating with the Milwaukee Police Department. And that was a long campaign, and there were a lot of protests at City Hall, and they brought all kinds of people to talk about their experience with Milwaukee policing, which unsurprisingly is fairly savage, particularly against people of color. People told very moving stories. And this one night we were all up in the special meeting room of the Committee on Police and Fire, I think it was. And the city attorney was there, and he listened. There were like hours of testimony and like really moving, like young people saying like, it's really hard for me to walk down the street. This young woman who's on the board of Voces de la Frontera, Naxtalia Sanchez, told the story about being undocumented and being with her undocumented mom and getting pulled over for a traffic stop when she was like 7 or something, and thinking her mom was going to be deported. And like, you know, it'd been a night of like just incredibly exacting, moving testimony. And then the city attorney got up and he said, well, I really have to worry about terrorism. And I was really like, I mean, sure, and it might rain, so take an umbrella, but why is that? Like, that word just seemed so violent and misnaming and dismissive of all the stories we'd heard that night. But as soon as you say terrorism, everyone kind of like, the other people on the board were like, oh yeah, terrorism, like, you know, and it was so powerful that he used that freaking word. And like, there was no terrorism being talked about. I mean, maybe by the Milwaukee police, but that's, you know, like anyway. So I think language is really important.
And Rachel, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up. I think it was fascinating during the, you know, the attacks on the Capitol, seeing the language change over the course of the afternoon to not use the word terrorism, and really journalists coming out to reflect on how the word terrorist has been weaponized against communities of color in the past, and how you can make a conscious choice as a journalist to use that word or not. And it helps to understand the context of that. So, you know, very relevant example, I think, to the way that we've seen use of language to describe the white supremacist attacks on January 6th. Alejandra Iuscely, what reflections do you have on this question?
I feel like something that I have seen, or we have been talking a lot about in my job, is this, like, similarly to what Rachel pointed out, but like this this intersection of like criminal and immigration, and the ways in which like breaking immigration law, which is actually about as severe as like a speeding ticket, I think, I forget what it is, but it's like, it's not a very severe breakage of law, is then conflated with a certain kind of like really intense kind of criminality, and the ways in which that hurts people who are in communities that are already like super, super over policed, are super, super surveilled, and already like criminalized due to, you know, physical appearance and just like assumptions about who they are. And I think even for people who do have criminal convictions, again, because they are in neighborhoods that are over policed and super criminalized, the ways that their immigration status and their status as someone who has a record is like held against them as this dual-edged sword. So I think something that people don't usually know is that if you are an undocumented person and you're committed of a crime, you like go in and you do your time. And then the day that you get out of prison, ICE is standing there waiting for you, waiting to pick you up, to take you into ICE detention, where you then wait until you're deported, or until maybe your case gets resolved in some other way. But it's this, like, it's essentially double jeopardy, but nobody's actually like talking about it in this way. Nobody's talking about all of the ways in which this kind of double criminalization is incredibly harmful to individuals, to communities, to keeping families together, all these things that we say we care about, but in practice, it's really horrible to see how that's worked out. And so that's, I think, partially a language question and partially a question of policy.
Thank you. And certainly, I think the book shines light on some of these lesser known experiences of migration or migration detention through the lens of language, and showing, you know, how language has exacerbated some of these dehumanizing policies, and, you know, then potentially helps us imagine a way out of that or beyond that. So thank you for sharing that example.
Yeah, I'll just quickly go. I think the book, like getting to read it like before it was released, and just like getting to be really specific with what drawings I wanted to put where, just reading it as it was, it gives you some sort of power back to a use of like words that are not traditionally used in like a positive light. I think since reading it, like I continue to say, you know, I'm undocumented, and it's like the reclaiming of certain words and titles that were placed upon us by people in position of power that have no idea what weight the word undocumented carries to somebody that is. And migrant, and most, you know, recently through the pandemic, just like xenophobia, like I felt like I saw that everywhere, like that particular word, and how it doesn't just exist within like a particular person or a particular culture or race or people. Like xenophobia is all around us, but in particular this year and last year, we saw it target a, you know, a particular audience. So a lot of it is having the opportunity to reclaim the use of language that was used to dehumanize us is now used, you know, as an empowering tool.
Mm. Thank you. And, you know, I think that that perspective is really helpful for thinking about how to use language that humanizes, and what choices we can all make within our daily lives that help put forward a more just, more inclusive society. I want to let our audience know that we'd love to hear any questions that you have or comments as you've been listening to Rachel and Alejandra and Iuscely share. As we you know, wait for questions to come in, I you know, would also love to you know, hear a bit. Oh, actually, I think we have a question coming in already. A request to see more of this beautiful book. So maybe Rachel, if you wouldn't mind giving us a, you know, a additional peek at a couple of the illustrations or sections from the book.
Yeah. So I just want to say, I just love this cover. I'm a Libra. It's really important to me that things be beautiful. So I love that this is so beautiful. And just to tell a little story of how it got made, Richard Morrison, the editor who I worked with at Fordham, who's brilliant and wonderful and supportive, and possibly even on this call. And I actually had a difference of opinion about this image because Richard said, nobody walks across the border in high heels. And I was like, that's actually really not true. But he like made that, we had to get the heels off this person because Richard was like, that just seems unrealistic to me. So this is what the cover looks like. And I think it's very lovely. And I should say that Iuscely is the main illustrator with the cover, but I was also lucky to have Voces de los Artistas, which is a artist collective in town. They basically opened their vault and said, take whatever you want for free because we see you as a comrade. So it has really beautiful illustrations. The wonderful artist, Sue Szymanski Beetala. Let me see if I can find, oh, this is a beautiful, this is about the free speech fights on the West Coast when itinerant workers, wobblies, would stand on soapboxes and then get beaten up by the cops in towns like Fresno and San Diego. So each entry kind of looks like this. So you have immigrante, and the English, Spanish facing. And I will say too that two things. One, we chose Spanish because it's the language most spoken by people on the move in this country, but you know, really ideally, and we didn't want this book to be too huge, but there are lots of other languages that people speak that it would be lovely to have things translated in. This is a picture of a May Day Solidarity March for Voces, which happens every May Day here, and which will probably change the trajectory of my life quite a bit. I'm trying to find one of Iuscely's wonderful illustrations from here. Okay. This is the illustration she was, do you have some? Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm. I love that your illustrations are palimpsests, Iuscely. I love that they're historical layers. I think that's amazing. Like what, this came from something else, this image, right?
Yeah, this is also this is a direct image from the border, but this one in particular is titled unrestricted area instead of restricted area. Yeah, and this is just from I submitted this to an artist collective. Yeah, this is another one in Palestine. And it was also the first time I ever worked in all black and white, so that was a challenge on its own.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing those. And I agree that it is a beautiful book in its images and the sort of vision of, you know, linguistic justice, as you said, Alejandra, that it puts forward. Rachel, I do want to come back to one specific question that I think everyone might be curious to hear more about, is your use of the term people on the move. Is so much of the book looks at sort of the evolution and complications of specific words to talk about movement. So could you tell us a little bit about how you came to arrive at that particular phrase as the reference point?
So that's not mine. I stole it from some really wonderful sociologists and other folks. And I have to say that I have thought myself into a corner with this one. So now, I mean, I was just thinking when we were talking before about the different words that, you know, we struggle so hard now for any refugee admissions into this country because of the terrible violence of administrative fiat in the past 4 years. But, you know, back in the day, I used to say like, well, that's kind of a terrible category because the idea of refugee is like, well, some people leave because they have to. And what, other people just leave? Like, oh, you know, let's just cross several borders with our stuff on our backs because it seems like a good idea, right? It's a terrible division between people to say some people are deserving of refuge and others just came because whatever and are migrants. So people on the move for me right now is the closest to neutral, though I'm sure it isn't, but like it's hard for me to say migrant, it's hard for me to say immigrant, it's hard for me to say refugee, except in very specific contexts because I'm so aware of how violent those terms have become.
Thank you for reflecting on that a little bit. And certainly it's something we've been thinking about at the Tenement Museum a lot, you know, as a museum that talks about both different time periods in history and different sort of political statuses for people that we are talking about, whether it's someone with refugee status coming to the US after World War II, you know, or Irish immigrants coming after the famine in the 1840s. And, you know, it's always helpful to see how words and terms for people on the move have evolved and how, you know, sociologists, historians, activists have thought about any broader categories for describing the experiences of moving to the land that we know as the US. So thank you for sharing a little bit about that. And another invitation to ask any questions, put them in the chat, any connections that you're making. The question that I was also curious about, you know, in thinking about each of your perspectives, was, is there a story from the book that you find yourself retelling or one that you would want to share with our audience tonight that's really been on your minds as someone who worked on this project?
I can go quickly. When I got to the end, it just has such a vast list of resources that had this book, you know, came into my hands and to my mom's hands, you know, 19 years ago when we were crossing, like how much help it would have given us, right? But knowing now, like how much help just that special section will give people who might, you know, bump into this book at their immigration attorney's office, and you know, the title might call, the cover might call to them, and they might just like, you know, page through it and then get to the end and see just the resources and how much just the wealth of language and stories, but also just the wealth of like access to real life organizations and people. I think it was very like just the like the cherry on top, like just the best detail to end on.
Thank you.
I'll go. So many of the stories in this book are stories that I think about all the time. So, and I'm lucky to have a job where I get to tell stories a lot. So like, you know, the story of the Pequot, which is a really early historical story, but just that, and this is, you know, from Jill Lepore's book, The Name of War, like at the end of the wars, King Philip's War, when the Southern Algonquians are like basically vanquished militarily by the English colonists, they say you can never use your name again. The word Pequot can't be spoken in New England again. But that didn't vanish Pequot people, right? So I tell that story all the time, just because it means, first of all, I think it's about Indigenous persistence and resistance. I think it's about the long sweep of migrant histories, because Pequot become itinerant in New England. You know, they're pushed to the edges. They wind up in cities like New Bedford. I love that story. It's a terrible story, obviously, but I love that story because it's about survival and invention and creativity.
Thank you. And I mean, certainly that one struck me as well, just the entries that reflect on Indigenous presence on this land and persistence and resistance do help bring into a much wider view our understanding of migration over time. Alejandra, how about you?
I actually kind of, going off of Rachel's, I was really struck by the ways in which New Bedford specifically comes up in the book a couple of times. I think the other place is in, oh gosh, what is it? I don't remember the term that it is, but it's the story of Eulalia Gomez, I think, who is a Portuguese woman who comes to the US as a child, is working in the textile mills in New Bedford as a child, like around the turn of the century. And then due to her union work and her work sort of organizing all of the other textile workers in the area, she ends up getting deported to a country that is also not her own. Her family's still unwelcome in Portugal. And, you know, she ends up settling in Poland and like having what sounded like a really beautiful, fulfilled life there with a husband and a family and everything. But it's still just thinking about the ways that like these single places that aren't necessarily really big on the map for us in a lot of other ways are really deep in a history of immigration, and the ways that that like individual lives pass through them, I think is beautifully rendered in this book. And Rachel does a great job with that.
Thank you. And certainly too, you know, for the Tenement Museum, we are located in a city that is traditionally associated with immigration, migration. And so being able to see this book full of stories from places that maybe in the collective mythology and memory are not as associated, and saying, hey, I can look in the place where I live and understand deeper the history of this land through stories like this. So I really appreciated that geographical diversity within the book. And we are coming down to our few final minutes of the conversation tonight. But I want to come back for our final question to an idea that you brought up in the beginning, Alejandra, of sort of a linguistically just world, you know, and you know, I think we all know we're living in a time of intense injustice, and probably many of us feel responsibility for working for a better future. And I would love to close out with this question of how can we all play a role in creating a more linguistically just society? And certainly that question is going to look different for each of you from your own perspectives, but what are ways that we can you know, be working towards this particular type of justice?
Can go ahead and kick it off. First, I do need to give credit for the idea of language justice, and you can read a lot more about it on the website of a collective called Antena Aire. They are a group of translators and linguists who have really, and interpreters who have really written and thought a lot about this. So kind of anything that I say here is my own percolation of their work and the ways that I've seen it move through my own. So I think that one of the best and easiest things you can do is on like a language level, like I speak English and Spanish kind of level, is familiarizing yourself with the languages that exist in the area around you and learning enough to chat with someone, to say something nice, to say hello, being familiar and comfortable with walking into a space, even if you don't understand the language, because that's someone experience like every single day. And just like getting used to that. And it can be really like alienating and scary to walk into a place. I remember going to a Cuban restaurant in New York once with a friend who I think spoke 3 languages, but not Spanish. And she was like immediately like, oh, I don't know what's going on. And it's like a very strange experience to know that people are talking and not know what they're saying and not being sure of being able to like bring yourself across. But I think it's really important to be able to meet other people where they're at in their language, even if it's just a little bit, even if it's enough to say like, hola, and then other than that, make like the face of like, I don't really know where I'm going from here, but I'm here with you. People get that. And just being really comfortable, not being catered to, not being censored, not being like assuming that everyone's going to come to you in English.
Thank you. Very practical suggestions. I appreciate that.
So a really important teacher of mine said of me in a letter of recommendation that he shared with me, and this may not have helped me. She recognizes that there's no sense but poetic sense. That might not have been a good thing, but I think it's true. And I think that when there are particular words that lie, like the example of the city attorney talking about terrorism, I think we feel it if we give ourselves time. You know, when he said terrorist, I was just like, not really. Or when you hear that like Antifa has been destroying our cities, like what? You know, and I think like, I do think we feel those breakages. I think we feel them in our bodies and we hear them. And I think we live in this really fast culture where it's important to be clever. And like, I think it's really important to attend that stuff, to let things make poetic sense or unsense, you know? And I think that we can all see how powerful language is, and we can all, you know, sort of reclaim words that are being stolen away. Like I love Iuscely's example. And I think one of the most brilliant examples of the 21st century so far is the Dreamer's reclamation of undocumented and unafraid as a badge of honor. Like that is a beautiful and generative thing. And it makes total poetic sense.
Thank you, Rachel. Iuscely, anything you'd want to add to the reflections?
I mean, it's okay to feel I think sitting with the feeling of being uncomfortable, like being okay with that. You don't even need to say anything. Sometimes you can just kind of sit there in that same emotion that somebody else is sitting and get to feel it, right? I think Alejandra mentioned that, like, you know, you have to feel that uncomfortableness because so many of us have the privilege of never getting to feel uncomfortable, and just like that privilege of having always access to a known language.
Thank you. And certainly, you know, I think the invitation to slow down, to think about words and understand their context, to feel uncomfortable, and use that discomfort perhaps as a place to try to understand someone else's perspective. I think those sentiments really do infuse this book. And, you know, I've been working at the museum for many years and read a lot about migration. And I think your book, collectively, your book, and, you know, this book, I see it really as sort of the book of all the communities that you were inspired by, that you did work with. I think this book really does bring a necessary perspective to understanding how language shapes our views of migration and how we can move towards a more just society. So I really thank you all so much for joining me in conversation tonight. For all of our audience out there, please visit shop.tenement.org to purchase a copy of A's for Asylum Seeker. And within it, you'll find, as Iuscely mentioned, many, many resources of organizations across the country. I believe actually you go state by state to look at organizations that support migrants' rights. So take a moment to look up the organization that works within your community, make a donation, learn about the causes that they're fighting for, and just stay aware to how language shapes our world. And Rachel, Alejandra, Iuscely, thank you so much on behalf of the Tenement Museum for joining us for this event tonight. And I hope you all have a safe rest of the evening, and join us again for our next book talk, which will be on February 2nd on the edible history of 97 Orchard Street. So stay tuned for more.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all so much, everyone. Take care.